third day here, and this is another presentation in the technology track. I'm Spencer Herms. I'm the track captain of the technology track this year, work over at Aspen Technologies. The presentation we're seeing today is cybersecurity for the metaverse. And our presenter is Paul Doherty. He is the co-founder and head of sales at the cybersecurity company CloudRise. I also want to thank CloudRise for being the title sponsor of our tech track here this year. So thank you for that. Now, without further ado, take it away, Paul.
Thank you, Spencer. So thank you all for joining. I was here last year talking about cybersecurity coming out of the pandemic. Two quick stories from that. First, my favorite piece of feedback. I was walking out of the doors here and someone pulled me aside and said, "Hey, good job. That wasn't nearly as bad as I expected." And after a pretty healthy pause, where I must have looked somewhat dumbfounded at her, she quickly followed up with, "Oh, sorry, I was expecting your presentation to be very boring, but you somehow made it pretty funny." Second, someone in the audience, oh, and by the way, learning about cybersecurity can be fun, right? Second, someone in the audience asked the question, how does quantum computing change your cybersecurity recommendations? This was in response to my recommendation that each of your passwords should be 16 characters long because modern supercomputer technology can't decrypt it. I remember him having this big smirk on his face because he knew that quantum decryption can break 16 character passwords. And he must have been thinking to himself, well, I got you. Putting me in a corner, I realized that we were just about out of time. So I quickly transitioned to tune into next year's session. And here we are. So what are we talking about today? Last year, I talked about how the internet's role in people's lives increased significantly because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and cybersecurity risks accelerated as a result. My talk last year was very much near term, 1 or 2 years coming out of the pandemic, as we transition more to a hybrid model of work and life. How is this one going to be different? We're going to look a few years out, up to 10 years out. We're going to talk about Web3, blockchain, and cryptocurrency in the metaverse. These cutting edge technologies are quickly gaining popular acceptance, and with more people spending time and money with these technologies, consequences for victims and opportunities for malicious gain by hackers are at an all-time high. Compound the acceptance of these technologies with advances in fundamental technologies like quantum computing and artificial intelligence, and the internet landscape is changing rapidly. I will speak about cybersecurity risks in this new landscape and what you can do to protect yourself and your company. But if you think to yourself, well, I don't have cryptocurrency, I don't use the blockchain, or I've never even heard of the metaverse, so this doesn't apply to me. Well, the reality is a little bit different. Bill Gates predicts that within the next 2 to 3 years, most meetings will be held in the metaverse rather than our current 2D model. And what is the metaverse based on? The blockchain. These technologies will start to apply to you, and so it's important that we all understand them. Before we get into the cutting edge tech though, I did want to spend a few minutes on notable cybersecurity updates from the last year, particularly the war in Ukraine. What's changed? I think the war in Ukraine and Russia, between Ukraine and Russia, has been startling to many of us in the West for a number of reasons. First invasion by a major power of a European nation since World War II. First conflict where ubiquitous social media seems to be exposing things in real time. And then third, first clash between modern armies with robust digital information, intelligence gathering, and cyber warfare capabilities. Ukraine in the West on one side and Russia on the other. We've seen some notable cyber activity. First, the Russian military has attempted to disrupt, shut down, and generally undermine the Ukrainian capacity to respond to their invasion. An example of this is the cyber weapon Foxblade. The Russian military sent that to shut down Ukrainian computers the night before the invasion on February 23rd. In response to Russian aggression, vigilante hackers collected loosely under the anonymous banner have hacked into various government websites, Russian government websites, causing embarrassment and some interruption, if not meaningful damage yet. Now, given the interconnectedness of the internet, a lot of folks have been worried about the collateral damage beyond Ukraine and Russia's borders. Thankfully, we've not really seen that yet. Much like the way the Ukraine has surprised the West and others of their defense of Kiev and their country, their cyber defenses have largely stood up to Russian aggression, which has surprised many. And this is particularly impressive growth from a country that only 5 years ago had its electric grid knocked down by Russian malware. For the West, there has been a slight increase in ransomware and denial of service activities from Russian criminal organizations, but I think most of us attribute that to the society-wide move to the internet in the West because of the global pandemic, more so than any notable Russian activity in the war. Any questions on that? Awesome. The other major trend that's come out in the last year is about ransomware and cybersecurity insurance. I talked a little bit about getting cybersecurity insurance next year or last year for your company because it's a best practice, relatively cheap and easy to get, and can protect you in the case of ransomware. The easiness with which you can get cyber insurance today has changed. It has become a lot more challenging and it's more expensive, and many providers are getting out of it altogether. Just for example, we at CloudRise, again, a cybersecurity firm, we upgraded our insurance over the last few months. Nothing major to put us in line with some Fortune 500 requirements around insurance minimums. We had a heck of a time getting it. We got turned down by dozens of providers. And why is that? With our case in particular, many IT services and cybersecurity services providers who work with organizations, small, medium, or large, are getting hammered with cybersecurity threats on a daily basis. Why? Because that's how the bad guys access other companies, typically through their IT provider or another third party. What's the overarching trend here? Why has it become so challenging to get? Ransomware or malware that encrypts business applications, databases, IT systems, rendering them unusable until the company pays the ransom. Payouts for ransomware attacks by insurance providers have been devastating providers to the point where they're getting either getting out of it or upcharging or adding stringent requirements to cover their risk. So my bottom line recommendation here is still get cyber insurance if you're a company. It's a fundamental cybersecurity best practice that should protect you from many different threat vectors, including ransomware. But if you do business with other companies or can be considered a third-party vendor, apply early and be prepared for added requirements, tougher negotiations, and just general higher prices. Any questions on that?
I'm often wondered why companies, instead of investing in insurance or other, IT defenses, if it would be better placed in investing in a real-time backup infrastructure and have that just have it be available. I don't know enough about, maybe ransomware is smart enough to go there too, but.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, we in the cybersecurity industry would, we recommend a defense in depth approach, so it's not just one solution. So backups would be another best practice. The issue oftentimes with backups is they're connected to the network. So oftentimes they get encrypted too. And then the second thing, if they're not connected to the network, then they're not always up to date with the most recent, information for folks to do their jobs. But I would say in general, yes, it is very important. A lot of companies, particularly hospitals, have been able to navigate the ransomware incidents because they have appropriate backups of patient data. Anything else? Brian, did you want to add anything to that, or? Brian also works in cybersecurity. All right, let's get into future tech. Blockchain, Web3, and cryptocurrencies. The cryptocurrencies' rapid decline has been in the news lately. Most folks still consider blockchain technology or a distributed database or ledger where digital information is recorded and distributed across nodes in a network, the future of the internet. Moving away from centralized platforms and services offered by Web 2, or offered by technology giants known as Web 2, blockchain known as Web 3 should enable regular folks to own, transact, and create on the internet with greater autonomy. And from a security perspective, proponents of blockchain have used words like trusted, secure, and unhackable to describe it. And I'll be honest, there are some security advantages. First is decentralization. Consider a database with lots of personally identifiable information. Those databases have been a target for hackers for the last 20 years, basically since the advent of Web 2. Back in those days, hackers stole personally identifiable information, PII, and credit card information and sold it on the early iterations of the dark web, which are basically black market web forums. Today, ransomware targeted at these applications and databases is the preferred method for a quick buck, though stealing PII and selling on the dark web is still very common. This information is spread out on blockchain. Bad guys have finite resources, and dedicating a lot of resources to hacking into a database makes sense. Combing the blockchain for individual records does not. Infrastructure and information is spread out on the blockchain, which makes it easier to protect. The next advantage is transparency and final record. In a properly functioning blockchain, when you perform an action on the blockchain, it is written into the final ledger. The action cannot be changed or deleted, and there is transparency on the source of the action. Blockchain participants can see who did what. From a security perspective, this is an advantage because even hacker actions such as crypto thefts can be tracked down to the wallet address, which in theory should dissuade bad behavior because there's a paper trail. Even if things are deleted off the blockchain, there's typically a record of that as well, which undermines hackers' digital escape routes. Finally, encryption. Encryption is built into the blockchain. Its essence is cryptography, where blockchain mining operations perform computations at a very high frequency known as hash rate to add to the blockchain and collect cryptocurrency, like Bitcoin. This is different from today's internet, where encryption was bolted on after the fact, which is always less effective. So despite all these advantages, I think you know where I'm going with this. But first, quick trivia question. Who said this first? I don't believe that any system is totally secure. Option one is me. Option two is Jen Easterly, who's the director of CISA. And then third is Matthew Broderick's character from 1983 film War Games, David Lightman. You're right, it's Broderick's David Lightman, who, if you haven't seen the movie, it's kind of like an original hacker movie. He talks about hacking into a Department of Defense computer. Now, if you want to scare a cybersecurity practitioner and provoke a hacker at the same time, say something's unhackable. In this case, technologists have been plugging blockchain as a secure future without the risks of the modern internet. Unfortunately, the unhackable blockchain is just like the modern internet, pretty hackable. We have seen some of the largest breaches in history over this last year, all because of vulnerabilities and mistakes in the blockchain ecosystem. This stat in particular, third down, I found pretty striking. Web3 projects lost over $2 billion to hacks in the first half of this year. Why have these happened? One primary reason: the tendency towards usability and adoption, leading to shortcut in technologies and security vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities, combined with human error, produce large breaches. We can describe this trend within the three innovation curves of cybersecurity. First one, you all in the enterprise technology space or the technology space create something brilliant. In the process of this innovation, security, though increasingly considered nowadays, such as the way blockchain was initially architected, is increasingly kind of put to the side as a secondary priority in favor of more rapid adoption and easier usability. This inevitably leads to vulnerabilities and bad security habits being brought over from previous technology. Innovation curve number two is pretty straightforward. Bad guys innovate on the new tech to get in and exploit for their whatever gain they're after, whether that's espionage or financial gain. The final innovation curve is the cybersecurity industry responding to the hackers, responding to the new tech. If you think to yourself, well, this seems to be a very reactive state to be in, you are 100% correct. So, as I mentioned, security after the fact is always less effective. As I mentioned earlier, though I think many technology innovators and developers and entrepreneurs have gotten better about recognizing security earlier in the software development lifecycle, such as the blockchain with encryption, final record, and decentralization, we still have a long way to go from a cultural perspective of building secure code. And though I think the intent was there around decentralization, transparency, and final record and encryption, the reality is really not as it appears. First, let's start with decentralization. Blockchain infrastructure, access, and ultimately data are increasingly centralized into platforms and companies. First, the infrastructure of the blockchain is distributed in the form of servers, but how many of you own servers in your home office? How many of you plan to? So to access the blockchain via your computer or mobile device, you need to utilize someone else's server. This sounds eerily familiar to Web 2 and lends itself to consolidation. For example, cryptocurrency mining operations have become highly centralized. Via BTC, pooling, and slush pool, 3 mining collectives, account for about 25% of the Bitcoin hash rate. From a security perspective, this centralization is highly concerning because the more ownership of the hash rate you have, the easier it is to control or influence the blockchain. And so if you're a Bitcoin owner, you're assuming a high level of trust in these 3 organizations, which, as I'll explain, they do not warrant that kind of trust given their poor security habits. Secondly, when you transact on the metaverse, in the metaverse or on the blockchain, or view your non-fungible token NFT, you're actually not clicking into that area of the blockchain. You are viewing an API call through a company, making your actions, even read-only, increasingly tracked and coordinated by them. So as a result, there are a huge number of API calls, typically executed by 2 companies, Infura and Alchemy. Today, these API calls are not using anything to verify blockchain state or authenticity of responses, and results aren't even signed like in today's internet. So the architectural equivalent of the way that the blockchain is set up today through Infura and Alchemy would be like every time you type in a website on Chrome, it first goes to Google corporate for approval. That's the way it's architected. Now, this matters less for written history because stuff on the public blockchain is already public, right? And there's a record of it. But these companies have almost unlimited readability into what you're doing, which is a security risk from a centralization perspective, as well as a privacy issue. Finally, data in the form of personal information, private keys, and passphrases, also known as recovery or seed phrases, are increasingly centralized. I signed up for Coinbase as part of my research, and they asked for literally everything: name, email, date of birth, social security, last 4 digits, social security number, address, citizenship, bank account information, truly everything. They also create and hold on to my private keys and the seed phrase or the master addresses and the passwords to my crypto, which is convenient for me from a usability perspective, but again, places a huge amount of trust in a third party. Which is a good segue into the startlingly bad password hygiene exhibited by many blockchain participants, including users, companies, and infrastructure providers. There is a sense within the cybersecurity industry that despite all these amazing advances in technology, we continue to have the same challenges from a security perspective. In this case, it all comes down to passwords. It makes it feel a little bit like Groundhog Day. In the cybersecurity industry, we've envisioned a passwordless internet. With your iPhone, for example, using Face ID rather than your passcode is a great example of this move to a passwordless internet. But unfortunately, the blockchain ecosystem has gone in the complete opposite direction, increasingly relying on passphrases or recovery or seed phrases for access to your crypto. And I couldn't help but notice the number of breaches and by extension, major theft of cryptocurrencies that have resulted because of awful password hygiene. First, on the infrastructure side, mining operators and collectives prioritize usability in mining over security. So those 3 mining collectives that I mentioned earlier that account for 25% of the Bitcoin hash rate via BTC, slushing and pooling, or slush pool and pooling, via BTC assigns a password 123 to all new accounts. Pooling doesn't require passwords at all. And then slush pool instructs users to ignore the field. This opens the opportunity for malicious actors to co-opt those nodes for their own benefit, as I'll describe with Sybil and 51% attacks. And as I mentioned, for individuals to acquire and hold cryptocurrency, a passphrase or recovery seed phrase is created, which becomes the way you access your crypto. If you forget it, you will not be able to access your crypto. I'm sure you've seen in the news people sitting on millions of dollars worth of cryptocurrencies with no way to access them because they've forgotten the passwords. It is a generated 12 to 24 word phrase that is easier to remember than the private keys or master addresses, which are the randomly generated numbers and letters for the destination address of your crypto on the blockchain. As a result of this recovery phrase being the only way back in, users, especially beginners, have a tendency to copy their passphrases everywhere. Unencrypted Word documents, email, cloud storage, generally on internet connected devices like mobile phones and computers. And now some blockchain companies not only enable this behavior to drive adoption, but force it for individuals who are their new customers. Blockchain company Deso, for example, has users input their passphrase into the Deso web browser, which is a huge no-no to put your passphrase on any internet connected web browser, and then automatically copy the passphrase to your unencrypted, or to your Google Drive in an unencrypted Word document. These are just it's another huge no-no. Now, one of the other options, again for beginners, is to use custodial wallets where organizations like Coinbase are responsible for management of people's crypto, including private keys and passphrases. Let's go back, there we go. This prevents a major centralized security risk, and breaches and theft have occurred as a result. You know, that an example is the Coinbase breach in 2021, where 6,000 accounts were compromised and all their crypto stolen. Now, a decentralized finance provider, DeFi, known as BZX, got hit with a massive 55 million crypto heist when a BZX developer got his passphrase stolen, and then which was used to siphon off funds from his wallet as well as the company's wallets and other users' wallets. Before I jump in, any questions or thoughts?
Do you have an opinion on password managers?
Yeah, so I'll get to that. I think for sure. That will be in my recommendation section. So this centralization, along with the drive for usability and adoption, which causes bad security habits and vulnerabilities, has created new and exacerbated old hacker tactics. First, how do hackers get at those passphrases? A tale as old as time, endpoint attacks and phishing. How sick are all of you of hearing about phishing emails? So before the Battle of the Hornburg at Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, King Theoden of Rohan said that no army has ever breached the Deeping Wall and that they'll be able to easily defeat Saruman's forces. So what did Saruman do and the orcs do? They found the one vulnerability within the Deeping Wall. This is not unlike the blockchain's encryption, which is solid rock and extremely hard to penetrate. But if you can't get at the blockchain itself, go after the vulnerabilities, go after the weakest link. In this case, mobile phones, computers, known as endpoints, are the way most people access the blockchain and are much more vulnerable to hackers. These attacks on endpoints impact individual blockchain users, as well as companies and platforms. Hacker gets in through a phishing email, which, by the way, according to Google Security, is still responsible for 9 of 10 breaches. elevates privilege, searches for high profile information such as passphrases, and then extracts the crypto as well as personal information on customers or the individual. Phishing emails have been used in countless attacks over the last 10 years. But with blockchain in particular, because so many actions are tied to cryptocurrency, which are representative of real value, these phishing attacks often involve the siphoning of millions of dollars worth of cryptocurrencies right then and there, making the consequences of phishing even higher than in the modern internet. And we've seen some of the largest thefts of currency in history of the last year. Examples include that BZX hack I mentioned earlier, which is 55 million, was caused by a phishing email sent to one of BZX's developers' personal emails, where the hackers were then able to steal the passphrase, escalate privilege to the company's network, and steal tens of millions of dollars from the Polygon and BSC blockchains. And by the way, and I'll get to with transparency and final record, because the actions were public, BZX could actually post the crypto wallets, the addresses, on their Twitter page of where the money had gone, but they couldn't get at. And secondly, Bondly, another major breach, hackers gained legitimate administrator access to the Bondly blockchain and stole 373 million tokens worth about 20 million at the time. So in addition to endpoint attacks, there's a couple new ones as well. Sybil attacks, where a single entity creates or controls multiple nodes on a blockchain under the guise of multiple identities, enables bad actors to unduly influence the blockchain, snooping on blockchain participants' IP addresses, which undermines privacy, pushing certain transactions over others, and generally altering and manipulating the blockchain and cryptocurrencies for their own malicious gain. Flash loan attacks basically consists of a type of exploit that takes advantage of crypto borrowing guidelines, leading to market manipulation. Flash loan attacks have caused some monster thefts. Pancake Bunny for 200 million and Beanstalk for 182 million. By the way, aren't these names just absolutely ridiculous? It makes it seem like funny money, but it's not. It's real currency. And typically, it's folks, completely innocent folks who suffer the consequences of it. 51% attacks are an extreme version of a Sybil attack. When an individual or organization or a country owns more than 50% of the hash rate of a blockchain, they essentially own the blockchain. They can reverse transactions, controlling nodes to change incoming ones, double spending coins, which basically is just theft, and generally subverting the final ledger. For example, hackers stole $9 million in 3 separate Ethereum Classic 51% attacks in August 2020 alone. And part of the reason why 51% attacks are so concerning is cryptocurrency and the blockchain was envisioned as a peer-to-peer payment system untethered to government influence or intervention. But if you think about the types of organizations or entities who can control 50% of a blockchain, there are very few out there. One of them is government, right? They have significant resources to do so. This is less of a concern in the US, but for China or Russia, especially as we see what we call the balkanization of the internet or the separation of internet into factions by country, into areas by country, this is a real concern. For more established high hash rate blockchains like Bitcoin, which is something like 175 trillion hashes a second, owning 50% is challenging, but not impossible, especially given our discussion about the mining collective centralization and their poor security habits. And 51% attacks are a real threat for new blockchains and forks off old blockchains. So as you can tell, the other security advantage, transparency and final record, is not as clear-cut as it seems. Malicious actors can unduly influence the blockchain, controlling nodes to change incoming transactions and snoop on participants, and then repeating transactions for their own gain. For example, the cryptocurrency Verge faced a Sybil attack last year where 200 days worth of data in blockchain actions and transactions were deleted. And though there is transparency in actions, there is also anonymity, especially for those who do not want to be found. Anonymity undermines tracking and investigations of who actually executed these hacks and not just aliases, usernames, or wallet addresses. It's not that we can't eventually determine who did what and what happened. It's that usually by the time we do, because so much automation and obfuscation are incorporated into the blockchain, as well as the modern internet, by the time we figure it out, usually the damage is done and it can be too late. When we do get names, non-repudiation, or the ability to prove someone did something, is extremely challenging on the internet and the blockchain, where folks have multiple aliases and can claim they weren't in control or be affiliated with certain groups rather than individuals. And even if we do, because many of these organizations operate out of China, Russia, Nigeria, Iran, North Korea, who we can't do anything because there's tension with the West in each of those countries. There's a lack of extradition treaties. And frankly, many of those countries support these criminal organizations. So there's no point. All of these factors put us in a position eerily similar, but also more precarious to today, where our personal data and behavior are centralized. And then simple mistakes can lead to data loss, but even worse, our cryptocurrency can be stolen. So what can you do? First off, recognize this is a bit of the Wild West. Blockchain is largely unregulated, which is kind of by design, right? The original architect of Bitcoin envisioned blockchain as a peer-to-peer payment system untethered to government influence and intervention. And though I think regulators will eventually catch up, in the meantime, many of the industry standards with regards to cybersecurity, fraud prevention, deposit insurance that we have come to expect from the modern economic system, like for financial services and e-commerce, just do not exist yet within blockchain. For just a few examples, the security of traffic back and forth within the blockchain ecosystem is not up to the standards of normal internet traffic. There's no concept of a trusted or certificate-based mechanism on the blockchain, particularly for API calls from companies like Infura, which means unlike when you go to Bank of America's website, which has a certificate pinned by a certificate authority, you cannot be certain of the destination address of where you land on the blockchain. Now, mentioning Bank of America, these new blockchain and crypto companies like Coinbase, for example, and others, they just do not have the security budgets or expertise or experience than traditional banks, critical infrastructure providers, and other e-commerce sites that we've had over the past 10, 20 years. And recovering crypto is not like when you experience fraud on your credit card. Recovery is murky at best. There is also no deposit insurance for crypto accounts to protect your money. And there are massive swings in cryptocurrency valuations, and hacks can drive down those valuations significantly. For example, Bondly lost 90% of its value after its breach. Exchanges can go bankrupt and you can lose everything. It is just not stable. Even this morning, I was just reading the news, and there is a crypto hedge fund where they just cannot find the two co-founders. That's not even cybersecurity related. That's just that you can't find them. And then there are all sorts of documentaries of crypto kings disappearing and taking all sorts of money with them. Which brings me to an overarching recommendation: the importance of internet street smarts. And for you companies out there, the importance of training your employees to develop those internet street smarts. And I think phishing is a great example of this. Just like the internet's early days, or maybe even better, the early days of Grand Junction in the West, you needed to have the right street smarts or the right awareness of the risks that you face on a daily basis. Understand that buying crypto on Coinbase or another exchange today is not like buying something from Amazon or doing online banking, no matter how slick their user interfaces are. And the Grand Junction equivalent metaphor that I would give is, walking down the street of 19th century Grand Junction would have been different from walking down the street of 19th century Boston, right? It was the Wild West out here in the 19th century. If you are going to buy cryptocurrencies, I'd recommend utilizing a wallet that's not connected to the internet, known as a cold wallet, for large amounts of crypto, and only utilize a hot wallet for small amounts of money and when transacting. As for those pesky passphrases, recognize that this isn't your bank password where it can be easily reset and you are more protected. Ideally, you save it offline, placed in a deposit box. If you must, put it in a password manager. I use LastPass. I think that's a popular one. I think it's like a few bucks a month or something. I don't know if you've used any others. Yeah. Yeah.
I've used Dashlane, but I think
Yeah.
LastPass is a little better.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's curious if you had which was
Yeah.
all similar.
And like, LastPass is in the way that a lot of these like cybersecurity recommendations that I'll share are kind of consistent across technologies because, they don't really change that much. I think LastPass is just good for, I wouldn't recommend you put your password into your crypto passphrase into your password manager, because in general, you shouldn't be keeping your passphrase on internet connected devices. Of all the places to keep them on internet connected devices, a password manager is best. But yeah, I use a password manager for everything.
If you wanted to put your key in a password manager, I'd probably break them up.
Yeah.
And like you can actually have like two entries in your password manager, and they could be not related to each other. So you're essentially taking the phrase and the key and you're breaking them apart. So your wallet ID and your passphrase don't need to be in the same entry in your password manager. So it actually take a hacker a harder time to actually comb through all your passwords to find that entry.
And that's a great example of just like the making it more challenging in increasing the time investment required for a hacker to get at you. Like that's just increasing the difficulty, right? And then do not leave it unencrypted on your computer or mobile phone in a doc or text file. Don't save it to cloud storage. And be very, very careful of inputting your passphrase anywhere in a web browser. Okay, that was a lot. Any other thoughts and questions? Yep. Yes, there are a bunch of options. I don't have a particular one that comes to mind. All of them typically, like Coinbase, for example, offers a few different types of wallets. And I think the kind of like general guidance is to understand a cold wallet is pretty technical to use, right? It requires kind of a high amount of like, understanding of how the blockchain works. And so I think there are like kind of middle options where, you might be able to hold on to your recovery or seed phrase, but Coinbase holds on to your private key, right? So that's the sort of thing where like, if you're just buying a little bit of crypto to, to see what happens, I wouldn't, my recommendation would probably be just use Coinbase, right? Because it's such an ease of use. It's so easy to use. But like as soon as if you get like into it a little bit more and you like start like investing large amounts of money, which I will not comment on. I'm here to list the vulnerabilities, right? But that's where you could think about like, upgrading your security.
Speaking on vulnerabilities and custodial wallets.
Yeah.
So these exchanges, you technically don't hold those tokens.
Right.
So I know a little bit about that, but is that something you could touch on to explain a little bit further about custodial wallets and don't truly own some of these things? Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and that's where there's been some massive fraud, not even tied to cybersecurity breaches. And I think like a great example is Quadriga CX out of Canada, which was Canada's largest crypto exchange. And basically the founder of it was it was a Ponzi scheme. So he would just, take the money and claim that, these folks had all this Bitcoin, but it wasn't actually the case.
So I guess that's different than Dogecoin and all the other cryptos as well.
Yeah, I mean, we could go down a serious rabbit hole, but the point is like, I think that's where you kind of the Coinbases of the world are like the safer option, because at least they're kind of like a Web 2 application to a Web 3 infrastructure.
Even if you hold the tokens on Coinbase goes under, they have to like
Yeah, you're not getting it back.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's-
And so that's an interesting thing. And you know, with Coinbase in particular, it got hacked in August 2021, and 6,000 accounts were compromised with all their Bitcoins or all their crypto stolen. Coinbase refunded them. So that was one of the occasions where like they were able to recover money, but that was when, you know, cryptocurrencies were way, way high. And so you just kind of wonder, like, you know, you've seen a lot of layoffs of crypto companies, blockchain companies. Like, if that happens again, we don't know if Coinbase can afford to refund all that, because that's coming out of their money or their insurance provider, right? So it's not like, you know, FDIC deposit insurance that you have in your savings account, right?
And
So
even bad actors, like I was in the NFT space for a while.
Yeah.
People, you were saying fraudulent activity.
yeah,
Of people that were attacking themselves and claiming loss.
yeah.
So it was like this double-edged like fraud.
And that's kind of with like flash loan attacks too. Like they're able to kind of borrow against, and it like gets technical really quick, but that's kind of the thing with flash loan attacks, is that they borrow money and then quickly pump the value down. And so they recoup, and then everyone else gets screwed. So anyways, yeah, we could talk about this for an hour. I'm going to talk about the metaverse next. So even if you do not own Bitcoin or any NFTs, or don't know anything about the blockchain besides what I just hammered on their vulnerabilities for the last 15 minutes, blockchain technology is coming to us through the metaverse no matter what. And what makes me a reliable and qualified narrator when it comes to the metaverse, the universal immersive virtual world, $1 trillion market opportunity, and latest tech catchphrase. I played World of Warcraft as a middle schooler. And by played, I mean, I was absolutely addicted to it. This World of Warcraft and other virtual or other MMORPG games were largely considered the metaverses of Web 2. And what makes me qualified to talk about cybersecurity and risks and fraud in the metaverse? I experienced it in World of Warcraft. The details remain murky. I blocked out a lot of that time from my brain. But what basically happened was I accidentally fat-fingered a trade where I accidentally sent a bunch of World of Warcraft virtual currency to someone without them providing an item in return. I remember being very frustrated and despondent at the time because I had been so stupid and made this mistake. However, I didn't think to report it because I figured it was, you know, I messed up, and so it was my, you know, my mistake. But sure enough, the next day, a World of Warcraft moderator refunded my currency right there. Now, what if this were to happen in today's metaverse? It's not clear whom I would have called. The moderators of the metaverse world that I'm operating in, as of today, they wouldn't be held responsible for that. And that's obviously, you know, in today's metaverse, you transact via cryptocurrency, right? That's real value. I could have called the FBI, who's shown an ability to claw back ransomware payments, cryptocurrency ransomware payments. But there's no guarantee of success with that one. And talk about a jump of authority, going from a World of Warcraft world moderator to the FBI. But with people spending more money on cryptocurrencies, NFTs, and spending more time in the metaverse, we have to consider these questions now, or else fraud will become rampant. So let's give you a business scenario. As Bill Gates mentioned, most meetings will be held in the metaverse in a few years versus our current 2D model in Zoom. So you hop into a chat room in the metaverse with your boss, whose avatar looks the same as it always does. You discuss this confidential transaction, confidential business deal. You maybe share some patient or health, or you know, if you're a teacher, some student data, or authorize a transaction where you send cryptocurrency to a third party. A few hours later, you talk to your boss, and they have no recollection of what you talked about. You become a victim of a hacked avatar or deep fake, and that money or data that you sent could be gone forever. Now, deep fakes refer to manipulated digital figures that look or sound like someone else. These will become common when the metaverse reaches critical mass. So what are my recommendations? With limited user participation today, these are mostly hypothetical, but worth noting is slowly but surely you spend more time in the metaverse. So the first line of defense in the metaverse is identity. Now, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We can use existing established identity verification and authentication approaches. In this case, the book and movie Ready Player One, where main character Wade Watts puts up his virtual reality visor, which scans his retinas and measures his voice pattern as he says his passphrase. You have been recruited by the Star League to defend the frontier against Zur and the Kodan Armada. Now that is an impressive authentication. Does anyone know where that quote is, what movie that's from, by the way? This is way deeper than War Games. Last Starfighter, 1984. Long before the internet was very popular. Anyways, in addition to identity verification, segmentation of identities and appropriate privacy safeguards will be really important. There needs to be a preservation of one's abilities to have multiple avatars, work and personal, for example. And then after that, appropriate access management for the virtual world locations, experiences, the chat rooms that you participate in. And obviously in those areas, there needs to be confirmed privacy and secrecy, much like the way that iPhone iMessage is encrypted today. Finally, modern know your customer and anti-money laundering e-commerce needs to be applied to the metaverse in the way that it's applied to the modern e-com today. So basically in the way that if you buy something from Amazon, that purchase is verified and protected. The same provisions need to be applied to the metaverse. Now, ultimately, companies and authorities will be responsible for implementing these changes. But I think as consumers and users, we do have power to force these changes in the sense that we won't transact on the metaverse until we have protections. Any questions on the metaverse?
What is it currently?
Yes, so it looks like a video game now. Yeah, it doesn't, and there are a bunch of different ones and they're all kind of competing for, market share. But I'm not kidding, it does kind of look like that on the right. And it does look like World of Warcraft. And I think the major difference is the barriers to adoption will be the capacity for folks to buy virtual reality or augmented reality hardware. And then the other major difference is it's real currency versus, video game currency. For example, I think like a PwC, a consulting firm, paid for $50,000 worth of real estate in a certain metaverse.
That's what we've been hearing about.
Yeah.
Like businesses and things.
Yeah.
Negotiating and scraping into the virtual.
Yeah. I think so. So here's an example. There are 6 of you in the audience. How many folks are on the Zoom? A dozen. So that's a 2-to-1 ratio. 2 years ago, it probably would have been the opposite, right? Or maybe even 18 folks would have been here. I think in 2 to 3 years, you will have your meetings that will be held with your company provided virtual reality, visor will be in the metaverse. And then that's the thing I think, kind of my goal for this talk is none of this really applies today unless you're an active Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, holder. But in a few years, this stuff will be top of mind for most folks. Yeah. No, it's the Wild West. So lastly, got 10 minutes here. Quantum computing. So what is quantum computing? I got to be honest, it's tough to explain on its own. Computing based on various quantum states. So what does that actually mean? traditional classical computing is based on binary digits. So it can be either a bit can be either 1 or 0, which means on or off. And computations are performed at a very high frequency, on, off, all the way down there. With quantum computing, the quantum bit known as the qubit can be on and off at the same time. And so after all that kind of nonsensical explanation, the key takeaway is that it's a very, very fast computer. For cybersecurity purposes, encryption, which currently underpins most of the modern internet and blockchain, is the #1 concern today for quantum computing. For example, modern encryption is based on the idea that today's computing would take prohibitively long to factor the product of 2 large prime numbers. RSA, a provider of encryption solutions, currently uses 2048-bit numbers as the basis for their products, which underpin the internet. That is unbreakable for computers today, but MIT estimates that a 20 million qubit computer could break it in 8 hours. Now think about that with your 16-character password I mentioned earlier, which is probably 100 bits or whatever range. Imagine how quickly that could be broken. Also, not to get one more parting shot at the blockchain, that encryption that we talked about that underlies it, that's in trouble with quantum as well. So what does this mean? First, relax. We're still years away from the effects of quantum computing, even though Google and IBM have announced plans for 1 million qubit computers. IBM only just released a 127 qubit one with a plan to roll out a 1,000 qubit one by the end of 2023. So we're a ways off from a 20 million qubit one. But those who are in possession of it today, namely the US and some other Western governments, academic and research institutions, and some companies, are likely not out to get you. And if they are considered a bad actor in cyberspace, such as the Chinese government, they don't really have the scale with quantum computing yet. And frankly, have so many other ways to get at you that they're not quite prioritizing it. However, why we in the cybersecurity industry are concerned is given the $100 billion that governments are investing in quantum computing over the next 3 to 5 years, including hostile ones, we will see some practical early adoption of quantum decryption, which will be on data that they may have already stolen that is currently encrypted. Which is why it's so important to deploy foundational cybersecurity solutions today to prevent those breaches from happening. I think in particular, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but as your company and as an individual, the basic stuff, password manager, multi-factor authentication, antivirus, training, really important for those phishing emails, stuff like that. So what else can you do? Unfortunately, not much at this point. As I mentioned, all those foundational solutions, and then also in getting cyber insurance if you're for your company. And last year I mentioned, yeah. So I think VPN is a little bit of kind of an old school technology approach in the sense that traditionally is used for remote workers using a private network to get back into their corporate perimeter. So yes, there's also just like in general, like more modern options because so much of like, I don't know if you work in an office or anything, but it's a little bit clunky. So like there are more modern options that, kind of push usability. The guy to talk to on that is right in front of you, Brian here. But
it's helpful for data.
Yeah, totally.
This is a data at best problem.
Yeah. And I think in the data in motion, that's another one where it's like, the snooping technology and stuff. It's defense in depth, right? You want to make sure you have all of like as many of these as possible deployed. But no, the VPN is good. So you want to determine how many data breaches data may have been exposed. Check out the website haveibeenpwned.com. That's a real website. It lists, yeah. So like, I shot at bonobos and like my data got breached. But like, it's helpful to know that because, in general, because you want to monitor your credit score, your credit card for illicit transactions, and then of course, like your email for like inappropriate password resets or logins and stuff. And then I think like, you know, from what I've read, like the Bonobos hack, like everything was encrypted. And so like a few years from now, they could use it they could decrypt it, right? So like, again, like, I don't really care if the Russians know like what I shop for at Bonobos, like my credit card from a few years ago is probably invalid anyways, but that's the sort of thing, like, it's good to just know, right? And I know I'm speaking rather negatively here of many doomsday. Yep. Yeah. It's have I been pwned? So with a P. Yeah. And then you put in your email. Yeah. That's it. You got some computer game lingo there. And so I know I'm speaking rather negatively here and of many doomsday types of scenarios. With quantum, for example, like how could a past breach possibly be our fault when companies where we shop, you know, like Bonobos for me, got hacked and my data got stolen. I think it's easy to become nihilistic about the whole thing with cybersecurity, like having the fear, like thought of like, what's the point of like trying to protect myself on the internet? I totally get it. I will say my final recommendation is, you know, what's the better approach is be a stoic, not a nihilist. The term nihilist comes from the ancient Greek philosophy that there was no point to life and that you had very little control over your life, which kind of lent itself to pessimism and hopelessness. The other ancient philosophy that developed at the same time was called Stoicism, which contended that, you know, challenges in life are inevitable and must be treated as opportunities to solve, overcome, or accept. So I guess my bottom line recommendation with cybersecurity after all this is you should be more like a stoic, like Marcus Aurelius, rather than a nihilist. So maintain good cyber hygiene, stay vigilant about fishy behavior, and continue to monitor for irregular changes in your financial and personal information postures, as well as your company security posture. Why do I say this? Because where we're going next, I'm going to read you a quote here from science fiction and cyberpunk writer Neil Stevenson from his 1992 novel Snow Crash. So 30 years ago, with ominous predictions about the future of computers. I don't see the connection between David's computer having a crash and you calling an ambulance. It was flashing up a large amount of digital information in binary form. That digital information was going straight into David's optic nerve. David's not a computer. He can't read binary code. He's a hacker. That ability is firm wired into the deep structures of his brain, so he's susceptible to that form of information, a metavirus. So what is the implication? What happens after quantum computing? The more we integrate internet-connected devices into our lives and increasingly our bodies, the more we're at risk for cyber attacks and monitoring. Yuval Noah Harari, the author of Sapiens, published a sequel called Homo Deus, where he writes that in a few decades, the highly educated elite of first world countries will be new iterations of Homo sapiens called Homo Deus. Technology integrated superhumans with advanced cognitive, physiological, and technological abilities. Putting aside the vast social, political, and economic considerations that this future would bring, the cybersecurity risk will become much realer. Not just our money and data, but ourselves. So what's my ultimate goal? We have to learn to live with cybersecurity risk because our exposure is only going to increase. And also, maybe in the meantime, we learn to try to disconnect because it will become increasingly challenging to do so. Thank you very much. Any last questions? I think it from a cybersecurity industry's perspective, it can't happen soon enough. I think, and that's why it's been so frustrating with, I think, blockchain and just cryptocurrency, that it went in the opposite direction, right? Where like, you know, passphrases, recovery, seed phrases became the only way back in. So the short answer is like as soon as possible. I think it's always like, you know, what we're planning for in the next few years will take another 10, 15 years to, you know, incorporate, especially within enterprises.
It's like, it almost seems like once a month, we're developing a deal.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's all sorts of, we're starting to think about, quantum resistant encryption technology. So like, there's this move within the industry to kind of look at these future technologies. But as I kind of mentioned earlier in the presentation, like, with the 3 innovation curves of cybersecurity, I like to say is like the innovators of the technology are first, then the hackers chase them, and then the security industry chases the hackers. So like we're constantly a few years behind. But yeah, hopefully soonish within the next couple of decades. All right, well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Paul, and thanks again to CloudRise for sponsoring the Tech Track this year. If you want to continue on the Tech Track, we have another talk coming up at 3 p.m. Scale your startup with a better tech stack. So please join us for that.
Thank you, Spencer.
Some like enterprise apps.